the way the parties select presidential candidates in the United States is through a process that involves the selection of candidates by delegates to the Republican and Democratic national conventions that occur during the summer. It used to be the case that the delegates to the conventions were selected by the parties and party leaders in the states, but now the delegates are selected through caucuses and primaries. Primaries are just elections that occur in the states in which Democratic voters and Republican voters in separate primaries vote for their particular candidates. Some primaries are open to people who are not registered for a particular party. The difference between a primary and a caucus is a primary is a regular election. A caucus is a gathering of people who have to show up at a huge meeting, and at the end of the meeting, they cast votes for the particular candidates. The way the parties have different rules with regard to how delegates are selected. In the Democratic primaries, the delegates are selected roughly proportionally to the vote that the candidates get in each primary election for the Democrats. For the Republicans, they have more winner-take-all or disproportionate allocation of delegates based on the votes, and so that's the basic difference. And after the primary and caucus elections, the delegates that are selected then attend the Republican and Democratic national conventions where they cast their ballots, and whichever candidate gets a majority of the delegates is the nominee of the party. If on the first vote, if no candidate has a majority, then they reassemble and talk, and then they take another vote until the candidate's selected. Typically, since this primary and caucus systems developed, typically the selection of the candidate is already decided before the convention based on the primary and caucus results. So that's how the candidates are selected.
Okay, but in that sense, why this seems to be a very different election? I mean, for example, for the Republican Party, it seems that one of the pre-candidates would be Trump. Is leading, but he is not going to the debates, and even so, he's still very high in the polls.
Yeah, well, the answer here really is very simple. Trump was able to develop a strong base of support within the party that seems to be completely loyal to him, and he's ahead in the national polls. He's ahead in the state polls. All of the candidates running against him completely miscalculated as to what their best strategy was to get the nomination. They thought that by running against each other, one of them would emerge as a challenger to Trump, whereas they made the mistake of realizing that he was so far ahead. They really all needed to attack him to bring him down and to get some of his voters to vote for them. Now, it's just pretty difficult because they're concerned that by attacking Trump, Trump supporters would just become further loyal and further entrenched toward them. But the strategy they opted, given how many candidates there were, just like what happened in 2016, they basically have split the vote, and Trump is basically sailing to the nomination at this point. So it looks. The only chance that they have is if one of the candidates is able to run close enough to Trump or to defeat Trump in the early primary, so that candidate can get momentum and voters can realize that they have an alternative to Trump. But at this point, Trump is ahead in the national polls and the state polls by minimum 30 percentage points, more likely 40 or more in the national polls. So his lead there is just enormous and looks unassailable at this point.
Okay, so you don't think when will we know that is going to happen in March or?
No, early on. That is in January and February is when the first primaries and caucuses occur, and so we'll have a better idea then. There'll be polls. We'll be able to tell, and perhaps in the polls before then, but we won't. But we really won't know until people start attending the caucuses and also voting in primaries. And the one we're talking about, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. And those happen very early.
And on the other side, on the Democratic side of the Democratic Party, why Biden? I mean, doesn't have really a challenge, And
No, it's typical, and there the answer is very simple too. He's an incumbent president, and the incumbent presidents normally are not challenged. One reason that they're not challenged, why challengers are not encouraged, if they become challenged, that could have a way of weakening them as a candidate in the general election. So there's a big disincentive for the parties to encourage challenges, unless the president is really doing so badly that the party thinks it needs to run somebody else. I mean, there are challengers. I mean, at this point, there was Robert F. Kennedy, but he's dropped out of the Democratic competition. He's running as independent. There was Marianne Williamson, who's running, and so there, and then there's a Minnesota Congressman Dean, who's running as well, but they have no chance. They really have no chance of
becoming.
Yeah.
And the other thing that it's brings the attention to us is the age of the president of Biden. Is it a concern in the states or no? And what do they think, or what do the electorate think in terms of the President Biden?
There's Biden's age that's potentially that's been noted as a possible problem here, but Trump is also older as well. But the thing that's really striking about this election is that both Trump and Biden have a huge proportion of voters who have an unfavorable opinion of them. Mm-hmm. That is, they basically dislike each candidate. It's just like in 2016, voters disliked both Hillary Clinton and Trump, but they were the candidates. And the key group of people to watch in the election are people who have unfavorable opinions of both of them. And those voters swung toward Trump in 2016, and the big question is which way will they swing this time? I think some of the polls suggest that it looks like some of those voters look like they'll swing toward Trump this time, based on some polls.
But they are not really independents. They are simply people who dislike both candidates.
Yeah, and the word independent is tricky. I think I would focus on undecided voters. I'd use that phrase because the problem is independent. There are three kinds of independents. There are independents who lean toward the Democrats, who really behave like Democratic voters. There are independents like Republicans, who behave like Republican voters, and then there are the pure independents who really are independent, but a great proportion of those are not very engaged in politics and are less likely to vote. So it's really this undecided group that's crucial here.
The other thing,
the undecided group in particular states that matter.
In particular, of course, in the swing states, or that territorial. That's the other question in terms of the structure of the elections. I mean, there are blue states, there are red states, there are states that are swinging. We would have like a re-edition of that 2020 election in terms of to look at those states, or something is changing in those.
Yeah. So just to remind you and everyone listening to this, we in the U.S. we don't select presidents in terms of which candidate gets a majority of the popular vote.
Yeah.
The winner has to get a majority of the electoral vote. Each state has a certain number of electors. If a candidate wins a particular state, that candidate gets all of the electoral votes of that state, with some exception in Nebraska and Maine, in terms of how the electors are allocated. It looks like in the last election, Biden won by several million votes in the popular vote, but he won the election. Yeah. Trump lost the election by 44,000 votes, about 44,000 votes in three states. So that tells you how close the election is going to be. And if you ask me what's going to happen now, is I would look at that as a frame of reference, and with the key states being Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Georgia, and Arizona.
But they go the deindustrialized states of the north that Biden was able to
in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost because Trump was able to get at least one of the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. He only needed one of those states. He got all three. Mm-hmm. And what happened in 2020, Biden got those states back, which would have been enough to win the election, but he also got Georgia and Arizona as well.
And in terms of political theory, we have this, this theory of the economy as a very important issue for the voter, no? Like they are retrospective and they tend to, why Biden, even when the economy is doing good, except for the inflation, he doesn't seem that to be able to capture that emphasis of the economy, or I'm wrong in that sense. I mean,
you're absolutely right. And now here's the big difference. It used to be the case that both Democrats and Republicans would perceive in the same way whether the economy was doing well or poorly. Now people's perceptions tend to be influenced by their partisanship. That is, Republicans, much more than Democrats, think the economy is in terrible shape. So that's the one thing that's going on. You have different perceptual biases that are due to partisan. The second thing is the fact that the economy is doing well in the U.S., at least at the moment, in terms of economic growth and the unemployment rate. So there are a lot of people who are working. There are a lot of people who have money to spend. The problem is, with the big increase in inflation that occurs, people are noticing that their money isn't going as far as it used to. That is, they're paying high prices to things, and they're focusing on those negative aspects of the economy. Now, the problem here is the inflation rate's going down, but the problem is that prices have risen, and the inflation rate going down doesn't mean that prices are dropping. It means that they're increasing at a slower rate, and so people are perceiving that aspect of the economy that's not as good as it was before when the inflation rate had been 2% all along. So it's differential perception, and also the fact that inflation is having a big effect because there are more people working, spending money, and in spending money, they're noticing the high prices that they're paying for things.
And how is it that party identity has always been very important in American politics, yes. But it seems that contrary to what is happening in other countries like Mexico, for example, party identity is becoming here stronger. And why is it happening that way?
Yeah, the difference is party identification in terms of its influence on voting was always very strong. If you go back to the early voting studies in the 1950s, party identification was the best predictor of voting. Democrats would vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates, Republicans for Republicans. But what happened over time, the big difference is that parties having about the same effect now, maybe a little more, but the meaning of partisanship is different. That is, back in the 1950s, party labels were more team or brand identifications. Today, they're more focused on issues and emotions toward the parties and toward the party candidates. And the reason is that the parties now are more ideologically distinctive on everything than compared to the 1950s. That is, back in the 1950s, the parties differed on attitudes toward big government and labor and regulation. Now it's those issues plus issues of race, moral values issues, abortion, gay rights, the environment, gun control, crime. Where the big difference is how race has become a divider between the parties in a way that it wasn't in the 1950s, because the Democratic Party was an uneasy alliance of Northern liberals and Southern conservatives, and race was kept off the political agenda prior to the late 1950s.
So in that sense, race is becoming stronger than class than it used to be?
Yes.
And related to that question, in terms of the demographic and the communities, we tend to know that the African Americans tend to vote majority Democrat, and the whites educated Democratic, and the whites uneducated Republican, and yes. And rural voters tend to be more Republicans.
Yeah.
How is it? Why the Hispanic doesn't have that kind of party alliance, or is
Hispanic voters don't behave quite like African Americans do. That is, Latino voters and also Asian voters have voted disproportionately Democratic. But race was really was more of a long-standing issue dividing the parties. It used to be an issue that in which the Republican Party was the liberal party on race, and the Democratic Party was the conservative party on race, because of the legacy of the Civil War. The Latinos only more recently became a larger part of a larger proportion of the population. And the one thing that's going on right now that's showing weakening of support among Latinos for Democrats is that working class Latinos and even working class Blacks have been voting a bit more Republican than they have in the past. Now, when we talk about this difference between working class and so forth, it's being defined in the polls as working class. Statistically, has meant voters without a college degree. That's how the data have been. And so they're not necessarily uneducated. The word uneducated may be an exaggeration here, and even the word working class may be a little bit of exaggeration because these people could have white collar jobs, as well as potentially more physically demanding kinds of jobs. But there, the Republicans have been able to make inroads among the working class voters, among white voters, where race has been sort of a wedge issue there, and the Republicans have been able to emphasize how the Democrats really haven't come through for those segments of the electorate, and so they've been able to make some incremental increases in support among those groups that have serious consequences when you're talking about close elections that are decided in particular states. So what matters is where those voters live more than anything else.
So the neighborhood, the state, or what do you mean by that?
No, the state, because of the Electoral College vote.
Okay. So the other issue that they come up a lot is terms of the reproductive rights of women. In what sense Biden would be able to mobilize more voters for that, or no?
The Democrats have been trying to use that issue to mobilize voters, and there was evidence that had a big effect in the 2022 midterm elections. And so in some states, I know in particular the state of Virginia, that issue is being promoted more than anything else, because you have a large segment of middle class women voters who have strong views on that issue.
And do you think that in terms of the campaign issues, those three, I mean, the economy, the reproductive rights, and another issue that we haven't talked about, it's immigration policy, because for Mexico, it's like very, very important. What would be the stand of each of the two candidates?
Okay, so the Republicans, there are two things. One is the Republicans emphasizing the poor performance of the Biden administration on everything. That's the claim they're trying to make. In terms of specific issues, the abortion issue looks like it's benefiting the Democrats at this moment as a result of the Supreme Court decision. The economy is hurting the Democrats because of inflation. The other two issues, which are issues that are helping Republicans, are the issue of law and order and crime. That's a big one. Crime.
Right.
And then the other issue is immigration, in terms of what's happening at the southern border of the United States, in terms of and also in terms of refugees coming into the United States through the southern border and in other ways as well. And so those are issues that those issues are issues that Republicans want to emphasize, because those are issues that Biden doesn't benefit from.
But why? I mean, crime actually has been reducing in terms of rates in the U.S. Why the perception is not that?
Well.
Or it depends on where you live.
Even when the crime rate increased in recent years, it's still much less than it was during the 1990s. Mm-hmm. The problem is it's a matter of perception, and the crime statistics are one thing. People's perceptions are influenced by what they learn about in the news, and crime has always been an issue that gets covered in the news. Whether the crime rates genuinely going up or not, it's always a leading issue in local news in the United States, particularly local television news. There's a saying that if it bleeds, it leads. That is, crime stories are often the lead stories on local news, and even during periods in which crime rate was going down, there were still widespread perceptions that the crime rate has been high or even going up. So there's a difference between perceptions and reality.
And leading with your book now, I mean, you mainly in the rational public, you mainly made the argument. I'm over summarizing, but that the public and the public opinions was rational, and if they get the right information, they would do rational voting, rational thinking. How much does that stand in this polarized ideological world of the media and the campaigns? I mean, of the parties, because you also just mentioned that before, that the parties were more centrist in the 50s, and that now they are much more polarized. And what's your take on that? I mean, how much has affected public opinion this kind of influence?
Okay, so in the rational public argument in the book, what people tend to overlook is that the last 3 chapters of the book emphasize the importance of the information environment, which consists of the media, but most importantly, it consists of what political leaders are saying and doing. And in those chapters, we talk about possibilities for of positive, constructive leadership versus more sinister forms of manipulation and deception. And we come to the conclusion that overall the information environment had basically performed pretty well, or well enough. That's something that's changed, but it's changed as related to developments in media, but also key developments in politics. There's a chapter of the book called Parallel Publics, and that chapter showed that when public opinion changes in one direction or another, everyone moves in the same direction. Everyone is getting the same information and is applying the same standards of judgment to that information. So partisans, Democrats and Republicans, have long differed in their opinions on particular issues. But when things happened and public opinion changed in one direction or another, Democrats and Republicans moved in the same direction. They're getting the same information and acknowledging the same kind of reality that's been occurring as well. Well, that's changed. The part that is the biases now that occur because of the strength of partisanship, where Democrats and Republicans are seeing things differently from each other. You don't find that. You find parallel trends among all kinds of other subgroups, but the parties have diverged. And here's an example that basically summarizes it. Back in 1970 to 73, Democrats and Republicans did not differ in their opinions toward abortion. And if anything, Republicans were more pro-choice. This is at the time of Roe versus Wade.
Okay.
Since then, public opinion has been pretty stable overall. We can talk. There are some periods where public's become a little more pro-choice or pro-life, and in more recent years, pro-life. But underlying that stability of overall public opinion is that Democrats and Republicans have diverged. Democrats have become more pro-choice, Republicans more pro-life, and through a process that's called partisan sorting. People have made sure their partisanship and their issue positions have become aligned with each other, with Republicans being the pro-life party, so that you have this overall stability. But Democrats and Republicans in the 1970s differed by hardly anything, whereas today they differ by 30 or more percentage points on that issue. And you find that on almost every single major issue. That is the Democrats and Republicans seem to be living in two different worlds and seem to perceive reality a little differently. Now that's been happening because of increases in partisan conflict that have occurred. The parties at the level of political leaders have diverged from each other. So this difference in issue positions, plus the fact that the elections now have become much more competitive. That it's back in the 20th century, second part of the 20th century, the presidency went back and forth between the Democratic and Republican Party. But the Democrats, for the most part, had control of Congress. Beginning in 1980, Republicans became competitive for the Senate. They took the Senate when Ronald Reagan got elected. In 1994, the Republicans won control of the House, and ever since then they've been competitive. So since the 1990s, it's become more increasingly a possibility that one party can control both the legislative branch and the presidency. That is unified Republican government. And by controlling those branches, they can also control the courts. So what you've seen is, during those years, you've seen cases of unified Democratic control of government, unified Republican control, which has corresponded with major changes in policies that have occurred because of that unified government. Obama was able to pass healthcare reform. Trump was able to pass tax reform. So elections have had more consequences, and Trump was able also to appoint more conservative justices to the courts, to the federal judiciary, and especially to the Supreme Court. So the stakes in these elections are much more important. These elections have had greater consequences. The elections are close. That's increased the emotional level of politics, especially emotions attached to issues like race and immigration and crime, and also abortion. And these increasing emotions, and the fact that people have become to perceive reality in different ways to basically fit into their ideological perspectives toward issues and to their support for parties. The nature of party conflict has really been, as we say, on steroids these days. And where leaders have come in, leaders have actually promoted all this. And so the big difference between so if you ask the question, has the public become less rational since the publication of the Rational Public book? One could argue that that's the case, but that's been associated with changes in behavior among elites. The role of the media has amplified all this. Political leaders have basically, it's gotten to the point we can actually say that political leaders have blatantly lied about things, and that gets communicated to the public, and the partisans perceive those communications from leaders in different ways. Whereas any lies that Trump promotes get taken up, or at least not criticized by the Republican base. And the question there is the problem with the public, or is the problem with political leaders? And I would argue that it's with the political leaders, because if a change is going to occur, it's got to happen at the level of political leadership.
So you think it's more in terms of the elites, either politicians or media elites, that are leading the public, not the public leading the elite.
Yes. Well, that's what's happened. But now it's gotten to the point where if political leaders want to change their tone, so to speak, their base of support won't let them. When Donald Trump started talking about, tried to remind voters that he was the one who basically enabled the creation of the COVID-19 vaccine and so forth, he gets booed at rallies when he says things like that. Yeah.
Oh, so you think it's something they cannot really control completely? But
that's the problem. They can't. They don't necessarily have full control over that now.
Okay. The other thing is, how are you studying nowadays emotions? Because I hear that in political science it was not so, in my times it was not so useful to so. I mean, how do you do it? I mean, how do you?
Well, if you read the political science literature has the field of political psychology has always distinguished between cognition and affect and emotions. Where it's been studied today in the context of current conflict is to study what's been called partisan affect.
Partisan
affect. Partisan affect.
Affect. Oh, okay. And
the phrase is actually affective partisanship. And that's the strong emotions. And the way it's been studied is you can study it with survey data, in which you ask people their feelings about the parties. In one way it's been studied in the election surveys is respondents are asked to rate candidates on parties on a thermometer scale from 0 to 100.
Okay.
Where 100 means warm, 0 for cold. And what you found is that Republicans and Democrats have differed substantially in how they rate the parties and candidates on that. Also, just to show you, I mean, one of the famous recent findings is that it used to be the case that among the public, people were reluctant to have their sons and daughters marry someone of another race. Okay, but post that. Today, there's more opposition among people, opposition to having their sons and daughters marry someone of another party compared to race. That is, they care more about party
party
within
done.
race.
Right.
And so that has a way of summarizing how the emotions have changed in politics.
The other thing is, I mean, in the Hillary Trump election, the Russian influence or the influence of how well established is a control for this coming election of those kind of influence? I mean,
well. I mean, in the upcoming, there are a number of things that are going to be monitored closely in the upcoming election. One is any attempts at foreign interference through social media and things of that sort. The other thing that's going to be monitored very closely is the administration of elections and the counting of votes, and the whole vote counting process on election day. In terms of the threat, I mean, it's widely acknowledged that it was a bad thing that the Russians tried to interfere through social media and maybe even trying to get through to Trump. The thing that we need to be mindful of is the question, well, to what extent did it have an effect on the election itself? And I mean, to make a long story short, there's no evidence that whatever the Russians did in 2016, that it had any effect on the election outcome. The best argument that's made is that it might have affected certain groups of African Americans in some places in Michigan, but even there's really no evidence. And the problem is that the extent to which the Russians were sending messages out through social media, it was such a small proportion of what was being communicated through social media and the media that it was not reaching, it wasn't going to have that big effect. Also, in terms of how voters would respond to that, well, any Trump-oriented voters would respond to that. There would be no net response. That is, they were already supporting Trump, and any Democratic voters who got that would probably dismiss the messages. And so the only people it might have affected were people who were undecided, but that group is small. And as a proportion, in terms of other information people were being bombarded with, that would just be a very small proportion of it. And so in upcoming election, any foreign, I would suggest any foreign interference would be, just ethically a bad thing. But in terms of the effect it would have, I would be more concerned about attention given to the monitoring of the election administration process. That is the counting of votes and the election rules and things of that sort. I would be more concerned about that than foreign interference.
Okay. Do you think that we are going to see like a repetition of the 2019, 2020 campaign in terms of like the issues and the way the strategies of Biden and Trump are doing their campaigns?
Yeah, I think it'll be the same, and I think it'll be even more bitter. The one difference, though, is that Biden is the incumbent president, so he basically has a record that the Republicans are going to challenge and attack. So that's the one difference is who the incumbent president is right now. In terms of what the outcome will be, it looks like, if I had to guess, it looks like it's going to be a very close election again. One would have thought that the Democrats would be able to win because they won in 2020, and that was before what happened on January 6th and all of that occurred, which should have weakened Trump and the Trump as a candidate. But it hasn't played out that way because of how the Biden administration is vulnerable, and how the other things happening and things that are unpredictable is what effect the third party candidates will have in the election, and there could be a few of them in the election. Robert F. Kennedy, Cornel West, and maybe if the no labels party runs someone, that could basically make things even more unpredictable. And then the big question is that will the Democrats be able to mobilize voters the way they were able to do it in 2020, 2022? And to repeat it again in 2024. And you have to keep in mind, in 2020 and 22, the Republicans did pick up seats in the House. That is, they did get an extraordinarily large number of votes. So even though they were disappointed in not doing better, it showed that they're really a formidable force. And also, Trump in 2020 got 10 million or so more votes than he got in 2016. So the Republicans have been on the ascendancy.
Oh, And the other thing is, do you think it's going to be more a campaign in terms of the media or in terms of house by house and like trying to reach out the voters or
I think the effort on the ground,
the ground?
by people kind of trying to directly contact voters will make a difference, especially in the states that are close.
Okay.
Okay, those ground game efforts are going to be important in those places.
So by now you think that Trump is going to be the candidate, Biden is going to be the candidate, and that is going to be very
I mean, right now that's the way it looked. That's the way it looked several months ago. But I mean, unexpected things can happen. The candidate's age and their health could be an issue. It could be the case that the polls may not have picked up the extent to which there are voters out there who might be tired of Trump and would be willing to vote for DeSantis or Haley in the early primaries and caucuses, and also to see how well Biden does in the and also what voter turnout looks like for the Democrats. Now the problem is that voter turnout in the primaries may be low because everyone thinks that that Biden is the foregone candidate. The same thing might happen in on the Republican side, but the Republicans seem to be much more energized right now for the election than the Democrats are.
Okay, and something that you just mentioned before in terms of this polarization of the voters, is Biden going to use like the image of the taking of the Congress and all those as part of the campaign?
Well, I think
he's not winning more voters by saying, this is a dangerous person for democracy, not just for the general ideas that he could have in terms of economics, but it's dangerous for the institutions, and he tried to destroy our democratic institution, or is not.
I think the smart strategy for the Democrats and Biden would be to try to just convince the electorate that they should be genuinely scared of what would happen if the Republicans are able to win the presidency and gain control of the House and the Senate. We saw that before after 2016, and what you have in addition to this is the threat to democracy that's been occurring as well. But that threat aside, the kinds of conservative policies that a Trump administration and a Republican-controlled House and Senate could enact should genuinely scare the Democrats, and it's that level of concern that the Democrats need to have in order to get the vote out. And Republicans understand that the stakes are very high. That is, they're equally fearful of a unified Democratic government, and they also see the opportunity that can occur if Trump is elected, along with them taking control of the House and the Senate. So the stakes are high, and and it's a question of to what extent Democrats and Republicans can best mobilize their voters to come out to vote on Election Day, as related to that threat that both sides will see if the other side wins.
It's going to be a very emotional election.
It is. It is.
And the stakes are high in terms of like if any of those parties win the presidency, the cocktail is not going to be very.
Yeah, and that threat will still be there. Although perhaps less so in terms of a threat to democracy, if for whatever reason the two candidates in the presidency are not Biden and Trump, if there's someone else.
Oh,
but that doesn't look likely at the moment.
Okay. And
that would change things completely.
And the last question: in the future, you see like both parties are young people to be the replacement of these two old guys?
Eventually, but it's not happening right now. It's not happening right now.
Okay.
But down the road, I mean, the hope perhaps for American democracy would be a new generation of leaders replacing these old guys.
Great. Well, thank you very much for
You're welcome.